Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining EAC's webinar today. This is Addison Tyne. I am the marketing specialist here at EAC. We will be recording the session today, so pending any technical difficulties, everyone will receive a replay of the webinar. Please feel free to drop any questions in the queue, and we will get to them after the presentation. Following the session today, we will have a short survey that will appear, so please stick around and answer these questions. Today, we will start off with a short introduction of EAC, and then our technical account manager and Creo expert, Bill Schlund, will be giving us an inside look of what is new in Creo 7. Our mission is to transform the way companies design, manufacture, connect to, and service their products. We're more than just a value-added reseller for PTC. We've actually been partnered with them for over 20 years with experts in 22 areas of product development. We're located all over the US with our headquarters in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We offer our customers everything they need for product development, from CAD software and simulation software for the full product design process, software for managing service documentation, and software for managing product data. We assist with design and engineering projects and offer webinars and PTC certified training courses for continuous learning. We also implement the industrial Internet of Things and augmented reality into business strategies to jumpstart initiatives around digital transformation and connecting all things in your company. We also offer our customers Formlabs desktop SLA printers at packages starting as low as $34.99. We try to make sure you remember that EAC is the company you need to partner with to get all the technology you need at the forefront to make your team successful. Without further ado, I will go ahead and hand things off to Bill so we can get started.
Thanks, Addison. Good morning, everybody. I am the aforementioned Bill Schlund. I'll be going through Creo 7, which was just released today. For those of you who have been using Creo for a long time, this is Pro-E version 35. But what we'll be doing is just going through just the core capabilities this week of Creo 7. There's some new modules. Obviously, there's some enhancements to existing extensions and things like that. But I thought for our first little get together with Creo 7, we should just cover the things that will affect every one of us, right? The core capabilities for sketching and features and detailing and assemblies and things like that. So that's what I'll be covering today. There's a lot in Creo 7, so breaking it down into at least this bite-sized chunk should be able to allow us to get this done in about 30 minutes or so. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are some improvements to augmented reality and publishing out information. We are able to now use combined states to publish out our Creo models. So that allows us to put in simplified or use simplified representations, exploded views, sections, things like that. You can't use style, where a style would be some parts are displayed in wireframe, some are surfaced, and maybe some are shaded. Obviously, AR wants things to be shaded, so that style option isn't published, but these other ones that are listed here are. So it just gives you the ability to switch between these different combination states to give the person getting this information different views and different representations. Just a good communication tool. So let's talk a little bit about the core modeling. First of all, Creo now, if you create a empty part, it will automatically be set to absolute accuracy. In the past, throughout its history, I think the default has always just been non-absolute or relative accuracy. And now there's some new templates that have underscore ABS or underscore REL for relative after them. For if you want to create a part, those absolute and relative accuracies are capable. There was also a config option that you could use that would allow you to switch from relative accuracy to absolute accuracy, but now that is no longer needed since Creo defaults to absolute accuracy. So you might have to go and work on some of your start parts and change those to absolute. You don't have to. It obviously will deal with relative accuracy, but as we go moving into the future more and more, we want to have the models as accurate as possible. Certainly sheet metal has switched over to be that way a while back, And as we can see down here in our note, that we also would want to use absolute accuracy when we're dealing with multi-body design, which is something I'll be talking about in a little bit. So Creo is just at the fundamentals changed a little bit with the way that it looks at the accuracy of the models. And again, the default is, 00039 or 0.01 millimeters. But you can set those differently as you choose. So some other things about core modeling, the import data doctor kind of looks at the geometry that it gets a little bit differently. I made this quick little screen capture of a Creo 6 import of a step file and also a Creo 7, the same step file. And basically this model, when I imported it, there was a solid body, another body that wasn't solidified, and then some surfaces. So as you can see, Creo 7 kind of distinguishes between a solid body, calls it a body, and then an unclosed solid body. So one that's open, it calls it a quilt, and then just a random surface kind of hanging out there. Whereas before it was represented and explained or shown to the user in a different term. Also, another thing that has been added under the view menu is that we can change the transparency. It'll look at part types, or yeah, I guess the type of geometry that it is. So if we have a boundary rep, that'd be a solid part, or a closed quilt, we can change the transparency of that as opposed to what is called mixed, which would be wireframe and open surfaces and things like that. We can independently change their transparency so that we can display as much or as little as we want. Some things have changed in the sketcher. So one of the things that we can do is we can mirror entities about linear entities and not just a center line. Also, some things have changed as far as when we have, kind of intent in our sketch. We mirror something, we have two things of equal radii or something like that. And now when we pick on the constraint icons, that will highlight the geometry. So previously, before, if you can see in this window here, if I just pick on, this line, it was mirrored, but, it just says, okay, that's your line. Now, if I pick on the constraint, it says, well, it highlights the line and also the entity that it was mirrored about. So it's giving us some really good feedback inside the sketcher as to how things are related to one another. So let's talk a little bit about another thing that's been added to the config is the ability to, when I go in and modify the sketch, change the dimensions, I can also bring along with it, as we see over here on the right, also the constraints. So I can see the constraints. And when these constraints first came out, they were kind of small, at least I have to wear glasses to see them. And one of the things that they added in 7 now is the ability to change the size, the representation of those symbols to make them bigger. So it's down below here. Here's where they're cranked up to be a little bit bigger. You can make them obnoxiously big by dragging this all the way to the right. But again, I kind of consider this a senior-friendly feature for us that we're readers sometimes when we're working with Creo. We can see those representations of the constraints a little bit easier. So let's leave the PowerPoint behind for a minute. I'm going to bounce back and forth as we highlight different areas, but let's take a look at Creo now. So first of all, well, let's make a part. I'm just going to say let's just create a part for a second. And when I do that, right away it comes back here. If I said empty, it would make it absolute, but you can see here we have a start part, or in this case the harness part, but it's absolute or relative, and it does the same for all the parts here. So these are the default templates that are inside of Creo. So it does distinguish between an absolute and a relative part. So just wanted to bring that up. But let's talk a little bit about the sketcher. I'm going to start right here and say, let's sketch on this face here, and we'll square it up, right? So we're looking straight at it. And if I want to create a line, I can start sketching here. And as always, the line will snap to the datums that have been chosen or highlighted as references for our sketch. And you notice it's not snapping to anything else. Something new that's been added to Creo 7 is the ability over here. Remember in Creo 4 when it first came out, here I'm going to say start snapping to geometry. So this is all new, this little menu pick here. And it's also under setup, but what we can do is say snap to geometry. So now in this case, when I want to start creating a line, it'll snap to this guy, or it'll snap to geometry behind here. So you notice it's snapping to different geometries behind this. And so one of the things people say, well, if I'm in an assembly, it's snapping to all kinds of crazy things and I don't like that. How do I turn it off, right? So there's a config to turn that off. Now, one of the things that we can see here is if I hold this down, just right now it's doing instant snapping, right? So it snaps to something the second it's over. Here I'm going to turn that off, but I'm still going to snap to geometry. And now if I go in and say I want to sketch a line, you notice that it doesn't snap to that edge unless I sit on it for a second, and then it highlights it. So now if I sit for a second on some geometry, it will become a reference for me. So kind of a way of still snapping to geometry, but not having it going crazy. Again, I can always turn that off, but as we see when we start getting into multi-body descriptions, a lot of times you're going to want to reference some other edges or some other sketches to create some new bodies. And this ability to snap to things behind geometry is actually kind of important. So you want to kind of keep that on. Now, just a little tip from me to you about doing this. So, you know, it was snapping to things that it was kind of bothering me. One of the things that I'll do is I can kind of turn this a little bit. And then if I start sketching, you'll notice that it doesn't snap to anything behind here, even though I have it turned on, right? It'll tell me when I'm perpendicular or hitting one of my references, but it doesn't see the lines behind here, even though that is turned on, right? So bringing it out of being planar to the screen is one way of doing that. And if that disturbs you, another thing you can do is just turn on perspective mode. And that does the exact same thing, right? And we're still looking square at our sketch, but again, it'll snap to edges, but not to the stuff over here. It just snaps to things that it sees, right, on the outside. So just another little tip. If you don't like that behavior, you can change that a little bit just by orienting your sketch a little bit differently. So let's take a look at something. I'm going to say, let's make a circle here. So we have a circle. And typically what we do, if I wanted to mirror that circle, I'd say, let's put in a center line. And then I can go in and say, let's grab this guy and we'll grab this guy and say, let's mirror it about here. So we have our sketch and, you know, obviously I can make it bigger, smaller. I can move them relative to one another and they stay relative to our center line. One of the things you'll also notice is if I hit this little equal sign, so it highlights both circles, right? Because those are the ones that are equal. So this is the feedback that we get from the constraint. If I hit the mirror, you'll notice that it highlights both circles and the center line that I mirrored them about. So it's giving me some really good feedback about that. But let's do something else. So I'm going to undo a little bit of this. So we just have our circle here, and I'll say, let's just make a line. I'll say, let's make a line that just goes maybe up to this guy. And let's kind of move them back, maybe something like that. So now, with 7, I can go and pick on our part here and say, let's mirror it about this line. So now we have them mirrored over there. And again, make it bigger, smaller. Notice as I'm dragging it though, this is a different behavior we haven't seen before. We saw before, I think it was in Creo 5, where we can do a mid-plane. We can pick 2 planes and say, make a datum plane midway between them. That's kind of what this is doing. As I move them closer together, it keeps them, and I can also move it this way. It's extending out. It's actually moving the center line to stay in between the 2 as I drag them, which is a different kind of behavior than what we've used to seeing. One of the things I can do, though, is I can pick on this guy and lock him, and then it behaves the way that we saw before, right? So if I pick on somebody, move them, now they just move closer to one another, and the mirroring line doesn't move. But we have 2 different types of behaviors we can get from that by doing this. So I just wanted to highlight that for you. So let's talk about some other things here. We'll go back to, let's kind of cancel out of our sketch here. One of the other things that we can do is if I go over here and I say I want to edit this, we can see the dimensions here, that how this particular component was created and the dimensions used to create it. There's a new option in here, and I'm going to go over here under options, And I put it under favorites here, but it's saying show the constraints in the sketch when I go to edit that. You notice right here, I used to use Creo 4 constraints because those are bigger, I could see them better. But now with the being able to change these or kind of scale up these representations, these symbols, it's a little bit nicer. But now, now that I've turned that on, I won't save it to my config, but if I go in and say I want to edit this, we can see now the constraints are here as well. So now I can tell a little bit more about my sketch if this particular line is parallel or vertical or equal length or any of that type of information. So just a couple of things there in the sketcher and also displaying sketches when we're editing geometry. Let's go back to our PowerPoint for a second. Next thing I want to talk about is draft. So the draft feature has changed, and it's gotten ability to actually draft things that already have draft on them would be one of the things that I would highlight. So let's open up a different part here. So here we have a part, and you notice that this is an import feature, right? So it's just one big blob, and it could be a Creo part, right, with lots of features in it. But we can go in and use the draft features. It's just the regular draft feature that's been around forever. And I'm going to pick on a surface, and then we'll say the hinge would be this bottom face. So what it's done is it's looked at that surface. The surface actually originally imported in has draft on it. In fact, it has 5 degrees. What it does is it highlights all the surfaces right around here and says that there's uniform draft already on there of 5 degrees. And it also highlights the radius, right? So that it's basically saying if you increase or decrease a draft or change it in some way, I'm going to reapply the rounds after you do that. But I can come over here and say, let's just change the draft maybe to like 8 degrees. So now it's updating. So it's a draft feature that we're putting on here, and it's allowing us to put that draft on it's just recognizing the existing draft and then allowing us to put it onto this, in this case, an imported feature. But it could have been a real Creo part with draft on it, and I could draft a drafted surface if I wanted to. But you know, since it's a Creo part, I could just modify the draft. This also works with things like cones and things like that that really don't have draft on them, but by their very nature, they are drafted. We can go and make modifications to those as well. I want to show you something kind of interesting here. So this little boss that we have sitting up here, there's draft on this wall or on this face, and there's draft on this face. I'll highlight both of those, and they have draft of 10 degrees. This back face, 0 degrees. This front face is about 35. But now if I go in and say I wanted to add draft, or have it kind of in a way it recognizes draft, and we can say this is our plane, you notice that it pops up the 10. It says those are at 10 degrees. And now I'll watch something that's kind of interesting here. I'm going to go in and say I want to add to our draft surface not just these two, but this guy who's at 35 degrees. And watch what Creo 7 does with this when I pick on this. So now we have a mixture of different draft angles, right? When I pick on him, it resets everything to 0. It says you didn't make any changes. We have different drafts here. I'm going to reset it to 0, and now you have to put in the draft that you want. All right, so that's one of the behaviors that it does. So I'm going to cancel out of this for a second, and I'll show you something else. So with these two surfaces already picked, like we did before, I'm going to say let's draft those again. And it's given us our 10 degrees. This time, I'm going to type in 10. It's the exact same number, but now I'm telling the system that 10 degrees is the degree that I want to input. It's just not the degree that you found. Now if I come in and I say, let's add a surface to this, it makes that surface 10. Or any other surface that I add to it, it makes that one 10 as well, right? So once I tell the system there's a particular draft I want, any other surfaces I pick to add to that will have that angle. Otherwise, it resets everything to 0, and then you have to put in the draft yourself. So just kind of one of the things that are actually kind of cool with 7 and being able to work with the draft. So let's go back to our PowerPoint here. We'll close this window out. In Freestyle, the Freestyle feature, one of the things that have been added in 7 is the ability, not only we saw before, we could always take a freestyle and drive it to a curve so we can have some control over it that way. But now, once it goes to that curve, we can also say we want to apply draft from that curve in a particular pull direction. By default, it puts in an angle of 10 degrees, but it can be anywhere between -90 and 90 degrees. So we can actually start to control the draft of our freestyle surface. And we can see there's a little icon here that represents adding that type of draft on with reference to a pull direction. So those are some new, it's a new capability in the freestyle feature. In sheet metal, some changes have been made. If you have a form that overlaps the edge, kind of cuts open the edge, and then you go to flatten it out, it kind of makes kind of a wavy end of it here. Now with 7, we can straighten that out. It actually creates something just called kind of a trim edge. So we'll just make a sheet metal part here real quickly. I'm going to say let's just make a part. We'll say sheet metal. And it's going to just use a template start part for me here. But if I want to go and put in a form, we'll say put in a sketch on this face, and we'll make a circle, something like this. That'll be our sketch form. I'll kind of pull it up a little bit. And then under option, we'll say, obviously we'll put maybe some rounds on it. And let's add some taper, maybe like 15 degrees. So here's our form, right? And it's kind of overlapping the edge, and you can kind of see as it creates this type of a feature, it can kind of create some things like this. So if we look at the flattened version of this guy, we can see the issue that I was highlighting before is it kind of makes, as it flattens it out, it kind of makes these wavy edges. And so one of the things we can do with 7 is I can redefine this particular form, and under the options, there's a little button down here that says trim the edges. So if we look at this face, the way it looks right now, and if I click trim the edges, it squares it up. So now if I redo this, you can see that it's nice and straight along the flattened version here. So trim edges is kind of a new function in sheet metal here. In weld, and I won't go through an example of this because I want to do some multi-body stuff with you guys before we run out of time here. But before, when we were putting in solid welds, if you go around corners that aren't square, things like that, it was kind of leaves little gaps. Now they've changed it in 7, so it makes a nice mitered kind of a corner around there. Also, you can create fillet welds or welds between different bodies. It recognizes bodies, so I'm going to get talking about multi-body in a second. And you can see we can go between a couple of bodies here, and then it makes a nice transition. Even zooming up on here, they don't exactly line up, but this does fill it in real nicely and trims everything back to give you a nice representation of your weld. So that's some improvements that were made in the weld module. Something for Render Studio. When we turn on rendering, and again, Render Studio is now part of the Design Essentials package, so that's why I wanted to highlight it here, some of the improvements. But while it's rendering, you can pause the render, if you needed to do something else, and then resume it again, so you don't have to start it up again. One of the other things is in the mannequin, which is another module that's included with Design Essentials, is that you can look through the mannequin's eyes and see out his eyes what he sees. Well, now you can render what he sees. So he's looking at the front of this motorcycle, and you can see that it's rendered here. And then one last thing that you can do is that you can specify where the floor is when you do a rendering. So before, it would always kind of pick the bottom of the part and kind of have it sitting on a table. Now you can define a plane. It could be higher, it could be lower than where the bottom would be. And one of the effects you could get is kind of have your part that looks like it's floating in space. If you move the floor way below, you just kind of have your part sitting there kind of floating in space, but rendered. Some people like that effect to highlight a product. So that capability is put into the Rendering Studio. So this is a big one. This is probably the biggest change to Creo since, I don't know, sheet metal maybe. This fundamentally changes the way that ProEngineer works or can work. You don't have to use multi-body design, but it's everywhere. So let's take a look at Why would we want that? We've been able to do kind of multi-body design in a way because we could make separate quilts in the same part and then, move them around and subtract one from the other and do that Boolean kind of stuff. And now it makes totally separate bodies, but still in the same .prt file, the same part file. So why would you want to do that? Maybe in this case, here's maybe a mold and we want to run in a cooling line and then kind of subtract that out and, kind of use that multi-body concept to create a final body, subtracting one from another. Here's an example where we're taking part of a multi-body, one of the bodies, and using lattice feature, right, for 3D printing. And so here we're just taking part of it and just saying I want to create the lattice in that portion of the body. Here's an example where we have two bodies, you could say, I don't know if it's a bike seat or something similar to that, and we want to cut a series of slots in it. And in this particular example, these are two different bodies. There's a yellow body, and then this one body was patterned multiple times. And then it's subtracted from here. One of these things with these bodies is we can categorize them as a construction body. So it won't be listed in a bill of material. It won't be listed in mass properties or anything like that. Sort of like a skeleton part in a way. It's used to help build something else. So that's kind of what was done in this particular example. And then final example, we're using flex modeling. So here, whether it's a parametric part or a step file or something like that, it has a concept here where you're doing some subtractions. Here's a split. I split this guy down the middle. So now I have two parts. Then I take one of those two parts and I split him again in half. And then I rotate half of it. And then I can remerge them together and remerge them with the original one. And now I've got a fully defined part that has, we've kind of cocked one of the arms off at maybe, 15 degrees or whatever. So it's allowing us to kind of dissect and break parts apart and then remerge them together after we made some changes, should we choose to do that. So let's take a look at multi-body here for a second. So we'll close out this guy. So I'm going to call up a couple of sketches here. So I have sketch 1 and sketch 2, right? Sketch 2 is this vertical one. Sketch 1 is sort of like on the top plane. So I'm going to start working with Creo just the way that I always have, right? You'll notice that there's something in the model tree here called bodies. And if we have multiple bodies, we'll be able to see those underneath. So it's sort of like an assembly in a way, right? We'll be able to see them listed down here. But if we don't use the multi-body concept, we can keep modeling the way we always have, and we won't even notice a difference other than there'll be this little extra tag here in our model tree. So I'm going to switch this over to using sketch regions, which we saw, I think, as Creo 5. But I'm just going to say, let's take some of this geometry and let's extrude it up. So now we've got some geometry going for us here. And we'll say this is it. So it's automatically counted this as a body. If I pull this down, there is body 1, right? And for me, if I look at it the way that Creo's always been, it's just a regular feature. It's an extrude feature, right? And we got some other sketches and things here. Let's go in and make some changes to body 1. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to say, let's extrude him up. I'll flip the directions. And we'll say, let's say through all. And we won't have it remove material. But now I'm going to say side 2, we'll say, let's kind of drag that up this way. And we will say remove material. So here I'm just kind of creating a little cutout in our body. So you notice the features have been added here like we've always seen them, but we also have our body 1 here that represents those two features. So far we're going along. Things really haven't changed much for us. Let's start to work with this guy. So I'm going to pick this and that. I'll say let's extrude all that out. So we have that extruding out. And in this case, every one of the features we have now have this little body options here. And what this is saying is, by default, it'll be added to the first one, just like it would in Creo, like it's always done. But here I'm going to say create a new body. And I can rename it, but it's going to call it body 2, and I can rename that whatever I want. And we're going to say, let's keep him as a new body. So now I have two bodies. You notice here it says 2. We can see body 1, body 2. You notice body 2 has a little green star next to it, just like in assembly mode, kind of like our active part. Well, this is our active body. If I wanted to make it, anything I create now gets attached to body 1, I can do that, right? So I can switch back and forth between the two. Let's go in and do something here. I'm going to go under View and say, I'll say, let's take this color and we'll apply it to body 1, right? So we've got kind of a green color here. I'll also make a section cut, right? So let's make a section cut. Let's make a plane here. I'll say through this guy, and we'll say parallel. So now we have a section cut, and it cuts both bodies, right? Single part file, but it's cutting both of these guys. And we'll call this, section cut A or something like that. So now we can have a section in our part, our multi-body part, should we want to do that. Let's go back to modeling for a second. I'm going to take this, I'm going to say, let's extrude that out. And we'll flip directions and don't remove. And we'll pull this guy out, maybe like this. And so at this point, under body options, I could say create another body, but really I want it to be part of body 2. So I'm just going to allow it to continue because body 2 is the active one. I'll just say, let's include him in there. And then additionally, let's go over and say, let's extrude this. And again, another addition. We'll say add that in there. So now we've got body 1, body 2. There's some things that we can do with this. Now let's start to get curious, right? What if I want to put a round on here? So I'm going to go over and say, let's add a round. We'll add it on here. Well, before I do this, let's look at each one of these bodies. So each one of these bodies, body 1 has 2 extrusions. Remember the main base one and then the little one that I did there. And then body 2 has 3 extrusions, right, that I've created. But now let's put on a round. So I'm going to say, let's put a round on this one, over there, and then there. So I'm rounding off these bodies. And what it does is it adds those rounds to each one of those bodies, even though the main round feature is down here, right, in the main model. So we can round bodies, kind of have features go between. Now I can't do a round between this face and the bottom face, right, because it doesn't know who to attach the round to. Let's go and take a look at something else here. Let's make a drawing of this. I'm going to say, let's create a drawing. I'll show you a little bit. So all the features like sheet metal, you can have a sheet metal body with other bodies with it, like PIMs would be a great representation or a great thing to have with multi-body and sheet metal. But here I'm going to make a drawing, default all the stuff, put it on a C-size piece of paper. And let's go in and we'll say, let's change the scale, make it a little bit bigger. And maybe over here, I'm going to say, let's create a general view and put it right there. So now I have this thing all set up and we can start working with some of these views. So I'm going to come over here and say, let's make this a section view, make a 2D section. Let's add in A and put the arrows over on this side. That view. So here we have our section. One of the things I can do is I come over here, double click to change this. Again, when we have sections and cross-hatching, it also understands bodies, right? Cross sections of a body. So the bottom one we're going to say is let's change the spacing of that and change that. So we can, even though we're in the same part, because there's multi-bodies, I can change how they're displayed. And we could say, let's go over to the next body. So this would be our vertical one. In this case, let's say, let's just retrieve some standard representation. And we could change the color on it. I don't know, make it blue. And say we're done with that. So now we have cross-section part. We can still show dimensions, right? So I can go over to annotate and say, show the dimensions for this view, grab all those guys, say, okay. I could say show dimensions for, like in this view, sketch 1. We can see those. You can't say show dimensions by body, right? Because it's the same part. So when we're saying show dimensions, it's by the whole body. It could do by feature, but not by bodies yet. Anyway, so here we've got a couple of different representations. Let's go back to this. Oh, I'll show you one other thing. This is kind of neat. So one of the things is I have basically kind of two parts here, right? Body 1, body 2. And we've never been able to do a bill of materials in a part before, right? We can put it in a table. But what I want to do is I'm going to come over here and say under quick tables, we'll say let's put in, you notice one for body. I'm going to say let's put that table in. Put it right here. And so what this does is it goes and takes a look at this and comes back and says, yep, you have body 1, body 2, and it's also looking for materials. So if we go back to our parts here, one of the things we can do with the bodies, I'm going to actually go to the top level. I can assign materials to them separately, but I'm going to go to the top one here, the top level, the main part, and I'm just going to say let's add some materials to it. So we could add, you know, aluminum. Let's add, I don't know, nylon, and let's add steel. So I can add a bunch, and you can do this. You could do this before, obviously, in Creo. But now I can go over to body 1 and say let's edit, or add some, assign a material. We'll say the bottom one is steel, and body 2, we're going to say assign. And we'll make that maybe aluminum. And then let's do an extrude, and I'm going to pick on this face, and we'll say, let's just grab the edges of this guy. I'll say, let's extrude that out. We'll say symmetric. So basically, I'm making a shaft. And now, by default, it'll add it to body 2, remember, because he's the current body. But I'm going to say make a new one. Let's make a new body, call it 3. Again, like I said, I could rename it to something else. And then here we can see body 3 is just made up of that single extrude. But again, I can assign some material to him. I'd say make him nylon. And then if we go back to our drawing over here, we can see, obviously everything has been updated as we would expect. But then we can also see the different bodies. We can add parameters to each of these bodies. I mean, and do this. So there's, you know, instead of assembly member name, and now it's model body name and things like that. So there's different things we can add to our repeat regions to pick on and pick out information about bodies, should we want to do that. Now, again, we have a single PRT file, and we really, and technically, would have 3 separate parts. So you can extract each one of these guys. So if I go to a body, one of the things, if I right mouse button, I can set it as, remember, construction body. That means it's just being used as a tool to kind of remove or add material, something like that. But what I can say here is create a part from the body. I'll say, what do you want to call the part? Give it a name, give it, you know, other information, and then it creates a separate part. It basically kind of does a copy geom of that part. Now it's a separate standalone part, still referencing the original multi-body part, but then we can use that to put in an assembly. Let's pop back, as I've been dragging or talking a little much here, to our PowerPoint, but a little bit about detailing. We just kind of made a drawing, so I kind of covered a lot of this, but here we can have a table for multi-body type of things. There's capabilities for the repeat regions to call out that multi-body information. The model tree can have columns in it now. So we can put different columns in the model tree. And one of the things we can do with drawings, I'll show you that in a second. So here's the model tree option for adding columns. Something that was been added, it's a DTL configuration, but when we do ordinate dimensioning, we can either say, yes, it aligns to the baseline, the 0 dimension, or no, it doesn't. They don't all align to that. And then also there's these extension lines where we have intersections and things like that. We can control the length of that extension. Just one last thing. Let's call up our drawing here. If I were to pick on a view, there's a new option in here called summary for view. And you can actually put this under a tooltip at all as well. But it tells you about the view and if it's a projection view and what scale it's at and what model it's using. So just kind of a nice little informational thing for different views in a drawing. So that brings us to the close of the presentation. I'm going to turn this back to Addie. Also, 50% off on Creo extensions.
Okay, it does look like we do have a couple questions, Bill, if you want to answer these. The first one is, does Multibody remove the need for AAX and or skeleton models?
It doesn't. It's a different type of workflow. You're going to have to think about it a little bit when it can be used. It doesn't have to be used. In a way, it kind of is a skeleton, right? Because your sketches now are the skeleton in a multi-body part. And if you have fairly simple assemblies, you could get by without advanced assembly. Again, advanced assembly has a lot of tools in it aside from skeletons and copy geoms, different tools to work with large amounts of data and things like that. But in a way, I mean, that's an interesting concept of it that for smaller assemblies and things like that, yeah, it kind of serves that purpose.
And then Brett Smith had a question. He said, any presentations on CAM updates? Mailing mostly.
Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, there's tons of stuff in 7. And what we're going to be doing is every week highlighting a different area. Today I did the core stuff because I knew that this affects everybody, but then we'll do different ones on simulation. There's some new modules for modifying geometry based on forces and things like that. And then there's CAM. There's also Simulate Live. There've been some really big advances in that for doing flow analysis and things of that nature. So I guess we're going to have to look to the future to cover those. They will be covered, though.
So thanks everyone for coming on the webinar and joining us today. You can join us next week. Like Bill said, we will be going over more of Creo 7 and how to transition seamlessly into the Creo 7. I do want to let everyone know we have extended our promotion of 50% off eligible Creo extensions. We will be providing a link to this promo along with registration link for next week's webinar if you're interested in attending that. In the email being sent out later today. Another reminder, there will be a short survey once we end here, so please stick around and answer those questions for us. Thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you on more EAC webinars in the future. Have a great rest of your day.